everybody to this specific panel, to the next panel in the ESPAS conference. And I'm very, very happy to have a fantastic panel here for a very topical issue that really fits kind of the discussions that we have over these 2 days. It is not only the question about geopolitics is back, but we also want to look at new security threats, actually. And this is what we are going to talk about. We speak about the future of global confrontation, and then there is a term, the battle of narratives. And I would like to already ask in my short introduction here, is it really a battle of narratives? Is it maybe a little bit more of what we are facing here? And that's exactly what I'm looking forward to discussing with a stellar panel. Quickly, just to say who is here. Valeria Kovtun is with me here on the stage, head and founder of The Filter, is a national media literacy project in Ukraine. We have Jakub Jakubowski, who's a senior fellow at the China-EU program. We have Dr. Emeka Umeje, lecturer of communication studies in the University of Ghana. We have my friend Chris Walker, also the vice president for studies and analysis of the National Endowment for Democracy. And we have Laura, you remain unnamed with your last name because you work for the National Intelligence Council, but a big, big welcome to all of you, either online or here in the room. When we speak about interference, we very often think about disinformation. And disinformation has become the most undefined term, undetermined kind of term that we have around, because it is now subject to a wide range of interpretations, from things that people don't like to see. Sometimes it is also the opinion of the other side. And I would actually like, for our discussion, like to work with another term, and that is information manipulation, because I think it fits very, very well with what all of you are doing. And the reason why I think the term information manipulation hits much closer to what we want to discuss, because it is one tool of a toolbox that we want to look at, that we see emerging in the world as a geopolitical tool. My name, by the way, is Lutz Güllner. I'm the head of the strategic communications team in the European External Action Service. My team is looking in particular at issues related to information manipulation, foreign information manipulation and interference, both in very concrete ways in our neighborhood, but also in close cooperation with many international partners and organizations. And we have come to one preliminary conclusion, is obviously that there is no single recipe to deal with this issue, that we need to think rather broad in our way of, first of all, understanding it, but also in addressing this. And just for our conversation, before I start with Valeria, we have identified 4 boxes, and maybe that helps us also for our discussion here, that are really crucial to understand and to address the issue. Number 1 is situational awareness. Really understand what is going on, who is doing what, how does this threat kind of change, how does it mutate, how do we need to understand it. Number 2 is one of the responses already, is a better societal resilience. So how do we protect our societies from these influences, from these risks, etc. Number 3, also we need to take these threats heads on by regulation, for example, which would be number 3. What do we have in our toolbox? What do we have in possibilities? And maybe number 4, that is also what we are discussing here, is the question of how do we address these geopolitical issues also with our international tools, international cooperation. What do we have here? But this by way of introduction. I'm very happy, Valeria, that you're here. And I want to zoom in right away into the situation that you know best in Ukraine. For years, we have not only analyzed, we have seen Russian interference, Russian disinformation campaigns, manipulation, information manipulation in all forms and shapes. Maybe I start with a very simple question. Has the Ukrainian society become more resilient against this? And if yes, what was the recipe? You know, what was really the important kind of lesson from this development? Valeria.
Firstly, thanks for having me here. I just wanted to briefly emphasize before answering your question that it's extremely important for Ukraine to be present in these conversations, because I remember just a year ago in 2021, I was mainly participating in the EU Parliament organized conferences with post-Soviet countries, and I was sharing experience with post-Soviet countries, always thinking that my challenges and my project challenges are not really similar to the ones of those other post-Soviet countries. So being here now and listening to these fantastic discussions, which I just listened today, it's just enormous thank you for having us here. And getting back to your question, absolutely, I believe Ukrainians got more resilient to disinformation or information manipulations, as we say here today. Firstly, one very clear thing for most of the Ukrainians is that there is an enemy. There is someone who's there coming to kill and rob, and people understand it. You don't really need to question the fact if you see it with your own eyes, right? So I think Ukrainians are resilient, especially to Russian disinformation, but they are still, there is a lot of space for growth because Russia uses other techniques, it uses other narratives, and if now, for instance, working with various audiences, we actually produce a lot of materials on mass culture, Russian mass culture, Russian TV episodes, which were being aired, which had been aired by Ukraine in early 2000, in 2010, some very popular TV series, and no one ever questioned the fact that Ukrainians were portrayed in this TV series as uncivilized, unintelligent village people, and Ukrainians were watching it and consuming this type of content without ever questioning it. Now, when they are looking at it and we kind of analyze this content, they're like, it's so obvious, but we didn't see it before. But suddenly now, with the war, lots of things have become obvious. So that's true, they are more resilient, but at the same time, they still succumb to manipulations when it comes to, sowing disbelief in the Ukrainian government, portraying that the West is not helping enough, or, using other narratives. And Ukrainians, there is a lot of work to do. Recently, we launched a national media literacy test during the Global Media Literacy Week. The idea was not just to check how resilient Ukrainians are to disinformation, but also unite people from all around the country. And despite electricity disruptions, not having stable connections, on one day, at one time, over 32,000 Ukrainians actually started passing a test, which had 34 questions, difficult questions, war-related, and 17,500 Ukrainians actually passed it. And we see that this is already a great change because many Ukrainians suddenly realize that media literacy and their knowledge of propaganda techniques is very much connected with their physical security. If you are in encirclement or if you are in occupation, you need to check information quickly because very often your security depends on that and your loved one's security depends on that. So that is why we see a lot of interest in the topic, and I think there's already a great shift, and we will work with that for sure.
Thank you very much. I have right away a follow-up question, and that would be, is resilience of the society, investing in resilience, is it enough, or do we need to do more? Are there other instruments that we need to develop to tackle this issue now from your very hands-on experience in Ukraine?
Well, investing in resilience to disinformation is a very broad topic. What are we going to do? Yeah, right. So firstly, I believe in media literacy, but that's more about long-term solutions and hoping for some results later on. Whereas I believe reacting to disinformation, pre-bunking, debunking, I think everything should be coming in complex. We can't really say there is a silver bullet approach and then we use it and then everyone is more resilient. Finland, #1 country in terms of resilience to disinformation, they've been developing media literacy for like almost 100 years. They had their own institution who coordinates all the efforts, and it's lasting since 1970s. So, and obviously there are some good effects, right? They are considered to be resilient. They have a well-educated society, and I've recently talked to some of the colleagues in Finland, and they say that people in Finland actually don't pay attention to disinformation much. And that's probably because they find it so absurd that they don't really feel like they should invest their time in analyzing it, because by default they already see this as disinformation. This is the result we want to achieve, but for sure it can never be 100%. Techniques are changing, narratives are changing, so there will be always a lot of work to do.
Let me enlarge a bit the perspective and go to Dr. Umajay and look a little bit into a different continent as well. In your own experience, if you look in Ghana, in your country, or a bit broader also on the African continent, what we see very often is that we have relatively, let's say, vulnerable information environments, let's call it like this, can be easily infiltrated, etc. But where is really the problem? Is it the weakness of systems? Is it interference from outside? Where's the balance in the biggest problems that societies in many African countries are facing?
Well, thank you so much. I think I have to start like this. If we consider China in Africa, one of the things that I take, for example, China has this thing they call Chinese-sponsored journalism training for African journalists. And this training, they take African journalists from Africa to China, where they're introduced to the Chinese way of doing journalism. Now, what you have is that, there are many journalists in Africa, they have not been trained, they don't have training opportunities. So when they have this opportunity to go to China, it's like, wow, this is an opportunity to go in and experience advanced training. And it's going to be in China, and I mean, it's also appreciably paid for. So they are very happy to go there. And then when they come back, they have a different world view about what the media should do and what journalism should do. So this is part of it. So you find out that in the long run, the system also has its own complication. I'm talking about broadly Africa. The only place you could say, okay, has a bit of resilience in South Africa. But even at that, everybody goes to China. That is part of it. Then China is not only approaching this engagement, in the media space in Africa just through media training for African journalists. No, it also has content sharing agreements with local media organizations. We have, for instance, Xinhua News Agency has sharing agreements with national media agencies in Africa. Then it also has sharing agreements with independent media organizations in Africa. Then you also have local Chinese embassies that have partnership agreements with local media organizations in Africa. So most of these media organizations are compelled to ensure that in the narrative that they promote about China or they write about China, it is largely pro-China. So these are critical issues. Then the second thing that I have also seen, specifically in Nigeria, is the issue of social media influencers. So it's easy to buy a social media influencer. It's okay, you're a social media influencer, you have like 1 million followers or more on Twitter and Instagram. Okay, we pay you this money, then you disseminate this flawed information to your people. I mean, I give you a particular example that happened in 2000. There was the case of Alex Schwab. Alex Schwab was an alleged money launderer who worked with the Venezuelan government and was fighting his extradition from Seychelles to the United States of America. So what happened? He paid a social media influencer in Nigeria huge money, and they started to tweet free Alex Schwab on Twitter, and it got so much traction on social media. So these are critical issues. The system is very, very loose, like you mentioned, but people also see it as an opportunity. People are looking for opportunities to maybe get on the global stage, but opportunity to also make money. So when they find some of these opportunities, they go for it. They don't really care. Then the online media space is also not very well regulated. I'll give you an example. I think that was sometime in June of this year. There was a story that broke on most online news that Russian kills 38 Nigerian mercenaries in Ukraine. It was misinformation, but it was everywhere. It was on the online platform. Most mainstream media organizations did not go with it, but it was on some prominent online platform went with it. So no form of regulation. Everybody does whatever they like. So I think it's a critical issue in Africa. I'm not. Why Nigeria is South Africa, but I'm talking about Africa generally. So
there is a very interesting study that you of course know also is the disinformation for hire that your colleagues did in Kenya, for example, to see that there is a whole industry exactly as you just described it. So would you characterize the challenge that we have here as a communication challenge? Is it a security challenge? Is it a regulatory challenge? Where do we need to put the focus on? What is the vulnerability? Where's the threat?
Okay, I think it's both a regulation issue. It's also some form of security issue. But in terms of regulation, the government might not do much, but I believe that what we could do, the achievement could come from, building resilience, training people, building the capacity of journalists, civil society organizations, and some academics, through training, exposure to training. This will help to build resilience in some of these. So they understand that, okay, when you have someone who is being paid to tweet certain stories, you know that this guy is just doing it for money. And then regulation. I mean, the Nigerian government has been saying since 2015, oh, we want to regulate social media. We want to ensure that social media, but nothing has been done. You have the same stories the same stories. So it's difficult. So I think it's what we need to do is to empower the local media players, empower the journalists themselves, empower civil society actors so that they can on their own resist, identify, isolate, and resist this narrative when they come from.
Which is, of course, exactly what happened also in Ukraine and where maybe one of the answers is lying. Thank you. I would just like to go on to Chris now and zoom into a specific actor, or maybe first a concept, because Chris, I know you have written and done a lot of work that's on the term of sharp power. Sharp power is a concept, well, I'll let you explain it in a moment, what it is exactly, but how does sharp power kind of manifest itself in the, let's say, in the information environment? How do we see it? How do we understand it? Is it a communication problem? Also the same question to you.
So thanks very much, Lutz, and thanks to the organizers for this invitation to be with this great group of speakers. I think it's fair to say that the foreign information manipulation challenge operates within a wider constellation of challenges in today's influence ecosystem. So, for example, when you've asked the question of whether this is a security or a communications or a regulatory challenge, I think in a way it's all of the above and more. Because in a sense, the influence challenges that have emerged in the era of globalization include strategic corruption and kleptocracy. They include these very complicated, fast-moving technological challenges that have hit all of our societies. Really, no society has escaped this, whether we're talking about the transatlantic community or sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Asia. We're all grappling with these issues that have emerged in the last 10 to 15 years or so, some of which even started before then. And I think that's really been a big part of the challenge for open societies, which had presupposed at the outset of the democratic recession, as Larry Diamond described it, and the authoritarian resurgence, essentially starting around 2005, now 17 years ago. That's a long time. We presuppose that the sharing of information, the digital information revolution, would work to democracy's advantage in the aggregate. There certainly have been some positives there, no question, in terms of how we've been able to share information, flatten some of the hierarchical aspects of the information space. But I think it's also clear to say that the intensification of polarization, the amplified disinformation that's come through digitization and bringing these things to scale have really created some challenges for open societies that we haven't been prepared for. And I'd suggest we're still not prepared for. In a sense, the comprehensive sort of responses we need that both of our first two speakers have alluded to, from very powerful, purposeful actors like Russia and China, who bring all of the tools to bear when they engage with open societies. They bring their political tools, their diplomatic tools, their media tools, their technological tools, and others. And we didn't anticipate this quite in this way. Just a brief word on the idea of sharp power. What really struck my colleagues and me about this work when we started getting into it now a decade ago or so was that the assumptions we had about what media engagement, what people-to-people engagement, cultural engagement typically was assumed to be from the conceptual framework of soft power, basically attraction, persuasion, pluralism, volunteerism, all of the terms that are typically associated with soft power, far too often were not in view when we looked at the outward-facing engagement of countries like Russia and China and others. All too often what we saw was an effort to monopolize the relationship with partners overseas. The ambition, at least, to censor or induce self-censorship in relationships when China was engaged and the like. And in our view, this simply was inconsistent with the dominant concepts and approach that, frankly, observers from open societies had used since the end of the Cold War. And therefore, we thought it was important, at least to put into the public debate, some sort of framework that would allow us both to recognize a different sort of outward-facing influence, where there are now dozens, if not hundreds, of pieces of evidence, supporting evidence from countries as disparate as Australia, Germany, Peru, Nigeria, Ghana, and others, to suggest that this outward-facing evidence, not always, but all too often, is far too aligned with concepts relating to censorship, dominance, obedience, rather than attraction and persuasion. And therefore, I think the responses we need to devise from open societies, from the democracies, need to be far more purposeful, far more aligned among like-minded democracies, and really embed principles of accountability, transparency, and fundamental human rights principles when we engage with our interlocutors from non-democracies. So maybe I'll leave it there for now. I'm happy to speak more about it. But in essence, I think those are the principles we're really struggling with now.
But you put a very important reference to something that I would like to come back to all of you in a moment, is not only our reactions to that, our responses to that, but also how do we build not only a better understanding, but also a normative kind of way of dealing with this. But let me park this point and turn to Jakub. And zoom into maybe a specific actor that you know very well. We speak a lot about Russia. My own team is highly specialized in Russian activities and exposing them. You all know EU versus Disinfo. But let's look at another actor, and maybe not the only one out there. A lot of people have identified China as an equally important player in this field. Explain to us how it works. Is it the same technique? Is it very different? Is it legitimate? Is it illegitimate? Is it maybe just a more robust form of public diplomacy? So where do you draw the line of behavior, Jakub?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me in this very important conversation. I think if I had to characterize China, I would say it's a relatively new player in terms of disinformation and the so-called battle of narratives, at least in a non-Chinese speaking informational sphere. But it's on a very steep learning curve that what we are seeing now. And they're advancing along this curve, learning how to do this. I would say primarily looking at how Russia does this. And it's not only about looking at the example, it's about actual cooperation and coordination in all the parts of on the Russian side, or the Chinese side, the party state that is involved in these kinds of operations. But as I said, it's a relatively new player in a non-Chinese speaking sphere. An important caveat, of course, here is Taiwan, where because of the language proximity and the geopolitical importance, China's presence is much more pronounced. It's most complex, comprehensive in terms of influencing the public sentiment, in terms of disinformation, in terms of developing assets. And by the way, it's a very important testing ground. That's how usually Taiwan is regarded as. And that's where, by the way, the expertise lies on how to counter Chinese ways. It's in Taiwan, in Taiwanese society. But leaving this aside, talking about the non-Chinese speaking sphere, I mean the West, the global South, the whole global infosphere, China is relatively new, and it has relatively recently changed from a more kind of defensive narrative informational stance into an offensive one. So up until very recently, China is mostly concerned about promoting its positive narratives on China's peaceful rise. Of course, sometime engaging in some more aggressive, assertive types of information warfare when it comes to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, those kind of core interests. But since I think 2020, maybe since the eve of the so-called war diplomacy, and especially since COVID and war in Ukraine, China is changing. Their position in the informational sphere is changing. First of all, we see much more assertiveness in terms of building narratives on not only China itself, but trying to influence global narratives on some key developments, including the responses to the war in Ukraine. But also in pure disinformation domain, I think COVID and now the war in Ukraine has shown us that China is actually engaging in crafting disinformation that is intentionally skewed fake narratives. For example, when it comes to the origin of the virus, trying to deflect the criticism, trying to undermine the confidence in the official mainstream views in Europe and elsewhere. That's the first point. They're starting to do this. Maybe they're a bit ham-handed since they are relatively new in the game. But another point I'd like to raise is the relationship with Russia. That is, the Chinese party apparatus has been engaging with the Russian propaganda machine at least since 2015 and 16 on the level of direct exchange between the people that do this. They are eager to learn, and most importantly, they're eager to cooperate. Because if you look at the Western infosphere, for example, since February this year, you'll see China intentionally amplifying Russian narratives, such as the most prominent one, that the war was caused by NATO expansion and it was our fault. That's what China basically copies from the Russian narrative. But also disinformation, for example, on biolabs or alleged biolabs in Ukraine that were about to be run by the US. That's where China also builds on. And it's very important, not only because they're starting to do this, but they're also kind of giving a helping hand to the Russians, since they've been eradicated from most of the social media in the West, the Russians. Now China there are numerous examples of China basically copying Sputnik and Russia Today into their own accounts, diplomatic or media accounts, and basically just helping Russia here. So I would say they are moving from this old approach of disseminating propaganda into this new approach of doing both the propaganda of the narratives and the disinformation itself. And I think they are slowly moving from this kind of ham-handed approach when mostly diplomats, the people that are easily attributable, they're moving from this approach into building local intermediaries and kind of concealing the origins of the narratives. I think that comes mostly from the Russian playbook.
That is exactly the right kind of transition to the question that I want to ask Laura, actually, which fits exactly, and you will give most likely the kind of complementary answers. If we now consider this is not classic disinformation anymore in terms of just kind of, in inverted commas, just of course, spreading narratives, be they right or wrong, but in their own favor. But we have seen, or the other way around, have we seen other forms of interference into the online or kind of the environment space? And of course, I'm making a little allusion that a lot of people are talking about. Do we see a tendency of also suppressing voices? What is your insight into that, Laura?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we absolutely do see suppression. Before I get into that, I just want to say thank you for having me here today. I'm from the National Intelligence Council's Strategic Futures Group, and our director wanted me to send her best wishes to ESPAS because of our long relationship with the organization. Many of you may be familiar already, but if you're not, the Strategic Futures Group produces a report. It's the US government's preeminent long-term strategic assessment called the Global Trends Report. It's produced every 4 years, and you can locate it at the Director of National Intelligence's website at dni.gov. In the most recent issue of Global Trends, we touched on the issue of digital repression, which will address your question here. Since then, we've conducted in-depth research into that particular topic of the suppression that is happening. And I wanted to share the key findings with you today. I think first off, it's always important to go into definitions. What we mean when we talk about digital repression is government efforts to use digital information and communication technologies to surveil, manipulate, or coerce individuals or groups to control public debate and prevent challenges to leaders' hold on power. And our primary assessment coming out of this research is that over the past decade or more, many governments, primarily authoritarian ones, but also backsliding democracies, increasingly have been conducting digital repression to control their publics at home as well as diaspora communities abroad. The tools of digital repression include censorship, manipulation and disinformation, mass surveillance, and use of invasive spyware against individuals. And I think it's really important to look at the key drivers underlying this. And it's fundamentally government leaders' fears of their own publics and of debate about political and social concerns, and that could jeopardize their hold on power. It's occurring against the backdrop of many of the other concerns we have right now with digital influence operations, or as you put it, the manipulation of information online. And it's part of that bigger picture. And so it's also part of the battle for narratives. If you have narratives that are suppressed, it's hard to have a genuine battle of narratives. So it's restricting freedoms globally. Just to give you a few examples of information related to this, most of this battle for narratives is happening on the internet. And according to the organization Freedom House, they just released their annual report about digital freedom in the last month. And again, for the 12th straight year in a row, they found a decline in freedom on the internet globally, with China identified as the country with the least internet freedom for the 8th year in a row. Also, we've seen research elsewhere that points to internet shutdowns, which are a major mode of digital censorship and a tool of digital repression, taking place in 34 countries last year for a total of 182 shutdown incidents, with shutdowns resulting in $5.45 billion in financial losses globally. So these shutdowns are shaping the narrative environment as well. They might be ways that authoritarian regimes are trying to prevent awareness outside of their illiberal practices, perhaps even including regime massacres of demonstrators. Or they might also be just ways of preventing their publics from organizing against regime interests. And unfortunately, as I touched on before, and I think that Emeka referenced as well, some of this is happening beyond state borders. We're seeing digital transnational repression, where monitoring and threats against diaspora communities abroad limits freedom of speech wherever those victims reside. So that can include for those of us living in liberal democracies. And unfortunately, as I referenced briefly, democratic governments, particularly backsliding governments with personalist leaders, and those are leaders who seek to concentrate power within themselves individually, are also engaging in this digital repression. In these environments, it often takes the form of internet restrictions to constrain civil society. It might also be legislation or regulation that gives wide leeway to use of invasive spyware and other surveillance tools. And then in turn, this is contributing to further democratic erosion in those places. I wish I had some good news to offer. Unfortunately, as we look ahead, the outlook, I think, for digital repression is very grim. The tools and the methods to monitor and limit dissent are probably going to become even more pervasive, targeted, and complex in the coming years. Meanwhile, we also have government leaders increasingly concerned about the behaviors and actions their publics might take as they struggle to address situations economically and socially with the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the food security challenges and energy crunch that have been exacerbated by the war between Russia and Ukraine. So in short, this is going to mean that we see a higher likelihood of rising digital repression in the years to come. Thank you.
Excellent. I think we really unpacked now in your 5 contributions how complex the issue is. It is ranging from a communication issue down to a digital repression issue. So really this spectrum. Now it's of course difficult to focus on one of them, but let me, before I invite the public also to send their questions please on Slido, let me ask you one question, and maybe we go the opposite order now and start with Laura. What, in your view, from your research, from your specific work, is the most important kind of element that we need to invest in now? Where is the gap that we have, either on a government or also in civil society? And if I can link it maybe to one point that that I think was mentioned by one of you, by Chris, do we have also internationally all the tools in place? Do we need to develop international norms in this area? Do we have any reference points? Sorry, I would have at least 125 other questions, and I would love to spend longer. We just need to look at the time. But Laura, think about what is for you the most important investment that we need to do? In which area?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you brought up norms, because I think that's one of the most critical, if not the most critical spaces where there is an opportunity to mitigate these challenges. It's common as we look back historically for there to be changes in technology and then there to be a lag in the development of norms, which, you know, it includes the development of regulations and laws. You know, I think one hopeful thing is to see that in many places within Europe and within the United States and elsewhere, we are seeing efforts to develop norms in the digital sphere to help protect human rights going forward and to protect our democratic systems. But one area I see for improvement is that there are so many disparate efforts. And I think that, you know, as we look forward, there is an opportunity for liberal democracies in particular to come together and work toward achieving a unified sense of norms.
Good. Laura, I need to cut you a little bit short because we're running out of time, and it's very frustrating to have 5 so fantastic speakers, which we need to squeeze in that time. But I would like to also hear the others about Where is it that we need to invest? Is it resilience? Is it costs? Is it something else? Jakub, short answer, please, but focus, kind of.
Sure. I would like this to the thing I've been talking about China. I think nowadays the most pressing concern is actually not looking at the let's say talking about the EU or the West. I think their outreach there in the so-called West is still a bit limited. It's easy to attribute many things. If you compare them to the Russians, which actively try to undermine the workings of the society, I think they're still not there. Their main focus, the China's main focus, is actually the battle of narratives. It's actually propaganda. It's actually framing geopolitical events in a way that will help them advance their goals, which is basically pushing the US out of Europe, out of Asia, undermine the transatlantic relationship, but also influencing the global South. And I think, answering your question, I think we should try to provide alternative narratives that will acknowledge the global South agency in this whole geopolitical rivalry we have, to make it credible. But I think that's the main call out, like the race to the EU and to the West. It's just basically stand up to this battle of narrative competition, because that's where China is focused at.
Excellent, thank you. Chris, you brought up the norms. That is one issue, but I would also be interested, of course, you all get the same question, but maybe I modulate a little bit. Do we have other ways of deterring these actors? Do we have other ways of imposing costs on their activities? Is there something else that we can do in that field?
So that's a terrific question. Maybe I'd answer it briefly in the following way. I think part of this challenge is that the issues we're discussing, the technological challenges, the information challenges, the challenges from both China and Russia are happening in essence at a global, multifaceted level, and then impacting individual open societies, many different ones, transatlantic community, global South, and elsewhere. And I think it's very hard for any individual country and its society and institutions to deal with this comprehensive challenge that's being leveled upon an individual country. And therefore, I think you suggested this, Lutz, part of the answer is to really accelerate and deepen the way in which like-minded democracies work together. And I would suggest specifically both building the complementary capacities of non-governmental and governmental entities on the one hand, and also being very clear that this is not a challenge that is purely internal or external. And in fact, to the degree we can create deterrent effects internally by tightening up our own standards, say, in the media sector, in the tech sector, even at universities that have become vectors for influence from these authoritarian regimes. If we can tighten that up, it will have the effect of being stronger against external malign influence. And so really encourage this idea that if we look at this only as external or internal, it's unlikely to be as effective. But if we can think about this as a mutually reinforcing effort where we get non-governmental, governmental, internal as a way to strengthen our resistance to external, that's the conceptual approach that can be most effective. And I'm drawing from a report we released in June 2021 called Sharp Power Democratic Resilience for some of those ideas and others. Thank you again for letting me speak here.
And needless to say that this is a big challenge of bringing all these fields together. Mr. Umejay, you also spoke a lot about regulation. I'm still kind of focused on what you think is the most important. Would that be one of the key building blocks that you're looking at, or do you identify something else that needs to be done to tackle, maybe not to solve the issue, but to tackle it in any case? You're muted. We don't hear you at the moment.
Regulation could be a part of it, but the most important thing at this moment is resilience, training. Training for journalists in Africa, training for civil society actors in Africa, training for social media influencers in Africa, and training for political actors in Africa, so that they could build resilience in them. They have the capacity to identify and to say, okay, They know when they see misinformation, a pro-Chinese narrative, a pro-Russian narrative in the media, they know how to identify and isolate. And this is very, very critical. And we need to start now. We don't need to delay any longer, because most times Africa is not taking into cognizance when some of the political issues are being discussed. But since Africa is a playground for most malign geopolitical actors, and it makes it easier to penetrate and to promote some of this false narrative about events on the global stage in Africa. So until we train individual actors to be able to have the capacity to resist, we won't be able to achieve much. Why I say regulation is good, but it will be difficult because that would come to the government, and unfortunately, the governments are not able to do much. The government will always say, we want to do, but actioning has become a very big problem. So instead of focusing on the government, let's focus on the individual actors, the journalists, the political actors, the civil society actors, and the social media influencers. And I bet you something good will come out from there. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
Absolutely, and thank you for these important points. Valeria, we come back to you at the end of our discussion. Now, we see there's an issue all over the world. Ukraine, the Ukrainian society has done enormous I don't want to call it progress, because it looks as if we give marks. I mean, we admire kind of what has happened. What else is missing in the Ukrainian society? Where would you still see a need to invest? And what would you expect from your international, at least like-minded partners, where either you from your civil society perspective or you as a Ukrainian would say, that's where we need help, that's where we need to work together?
Yeah, you're right. It's absolutely phenomenal in a way that we have this sense of unity, which helps us do things quite quickly, and we can come up with genius ad hoc solutions. And the coordination part, I think, is going well. We have enormous support from media organizations, from regional NGOs, from civil society in general, and from the government. I'm honestly. Filter Project is blessed with political support, with support from the civil society, and it's just something we should preserve. But at the same time, I think we need to think long-term more. It's a lot about the reconstruction plan for Ukraine for the future. But I also think, and it's from my experience, that despite Ukraine is great with quick solutions, it still needs support in policy making and collecting data, analyzing data, and planning long term. And I think we lose this skill in a way because we always live in a volatile situation. We live in an environment where we do not know what's going to happen tomorrow. Today, our team is functioning well, and tomorrow, half of the country is without electricity. So living in this environment, never knowing what's going to happen, it's kind of at the back of your mind. You're kind of deprived of this idea that you need to plan long term, whereas we do not want Russia to put our life on hold. On 23rd of February, our team was discussing a strategy, media literacy plan for next 5 years. It was more like a protest against all the news we were receiving, all these warnings that Russia was preparing a war. We were like, well, it might be indeed so, but it doesn't mean that we should be just sitting there waiting and not doing anything. So I think exchanging experiences, having these dialogues which we are having now with Ukraine, providing you with some ideas on how to be more efficient, and EU and other partners helping Ukraine in terms of building our life long ahead and planning the policy which we also need so much.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. It's always a slight hint of frustration that we cannot dig deeper. I have also tried to weave in your questions into this debate, and I will not even attempt to summarize any of it, but I just want to make maybe two concluding remarks. The scope of the issue, the complexity of the issue sometimes prevents us from dealing with it. And I think what all of you have shown from your respective areas of work is we can put the finger on certain things and can make kind of progress. We don't need to have the grand design in this area. The second point is, I think disinformation, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting your views, is not just about communication. It's not just a communication challenge. It's so much more. It's about media. It's about influence. It's about the digital world. It's about regulation. It's about better situational awareness. It's about, and I can give you at least another 12, 15, maybe more kind of aspects to that. That makes it difficult as a policy area, but I think with this understanding that also this panel here showed, that's the necessary first step, even if there is a lot to do. I am very aware that I couldn't weave in all the questions that came here. They're extremely interesting questions. I can only look at the organizers and say, we need to do this as soon as possible back again. And I would like to, first of all, thank the panelists really for extremely interesting insights, and of course you as a public for listening and being patient. Thank you very much.